This conference is being recorded.
Good morning, everyone. It is October 13th, 2018, and this is the John Chappell Natural Philosophy Society Science Chat. And I am your moderator host, Franklin Hu. And this is, please visit our website at naturalphilosophy.org, where you can join us and join in a discussion of dissident science topics. You can do that. We have forums, and we also have a wiki, and you can also find us on Facebook. So please find us in social media. Seems like my controls on my presentation here are a little bit pokey. Doesn't want to advance the slide for me. So you guys seeing the slides there?
Yes.
Yes, I can't seem to advance the slide here to get to the next thing here. Okay, there we go. Now my slides are working again. Okay, so you can find us on social media, Facebook. Also, you can find our YouTube channel where we post recordings of this whenever I get around to it. And if you'd like to help, we've set up a program called Basecamp, and you can help us organize and keep growing. Now, also coming up this June is our conference, which will be June 26th to the 29th. And it's going to be at the University of Washington in Seattle, which is where I am broadcasting from here at 7 o'clock in the morning. Beautiful place to come visit during June. And our keynote speaker will be Dr. Gerald Pollack from actually the University of Washington. And he's going to be talking about the fourth state of water and scientific activism. Okay, so this week I had announced that the topic we will be looking at is going to be about ancient technology. So unless anyone else has anything to bring up, I thought I'd go over these cases where there's apparently the use of technology well beyond what should have been available. So this is sometimes called like the ancient alien hypothesis, where they think that ancient man did have access to a lot of technology that was subsequently lost. But that's what we'll be discussing here. Anyone else here watch the program Ancient Aliens? You have any Ancient Alien fans here?
I think I might have read, there's some books on that. I think I might have read one of the books.
Yeah, I think one of the oldest ones would have been like the Chariots of the Gods.
Right.
For example. So, Michael, did you raise your flag?
Well, as far as Ancient Aliens, I just corresponded an email to Bruce Gernon, who went through a time-lapse phenomenon in his airplane back in the 1970s. And I gave him my theory of how time can slow down according to my ether model. Well, anyway, part of that is that when he was flying through the Bermuda Triangle, he insists and is cannot be convinced otherwise that he went through a time warp phenomenon. But well, that's what physics calls a time warp. But I believe it's where time slows down because of connection with an ether, the universal ether, which has the same time or vibratory rate everywhere because of the outer space ether, which is very low energy, unmagnetized. It's not associated with quantum dynamics, and that if you are in a craft that is subjected to that kind of an energy from anything, such as an ancient alien technology, your time frame will slow down because you are connected to the ether macrocosm, which is outer space, and it's a slower time rate because the vibratory rate is slower because there's less magnetic energy because it's in outer space. There's not as much matter or quantum magnetic energy going on, and the idea about Bermuda Triangle is that in ancient times, these ancient technology groups wanted to have their ether technology in lands like Atlantis, which went to near Florida, and they wanted have a learning area for primitive man so he can see the benefits of advanced civilization, and that eventually these lands sank, but that the crystals are still in the bottom of the ocean there, and if a metallic craft flies over it, it can fall under the spell of this one of these energy cells coming from the ancient technology down under the, that used to exist in Atlantis, and that you can still have boats and planes fall under the spell of those energy cells. Anyway, that's what I think. I've interested Bruce in that, and we corresponded again just the other day. I don't know why, but he got in touch with me about it, so I sent him that message.
Yeah, the Bermuda Triangle is being possibly one of these ancient technology areas. I haven't heard of that one in particular, but certainly it's a mystery. But I thought I'd start us out with something a little bit more tame. Let's me go ahead and share my screen here. Okay, so this is as close as I can come to a legitimate archaeological mystery here. And this is called the Antikythera mechanism. So apparently there was a shipwreck, and inside this shipwreck, they discovered this clock mechanism I'm showing you. So this clock mechanism looks pretty sophisticated here. And they dated this thing between 150 to 100 BC, which means it's much older than when we had technology to make these clocks. So it's kind of a mystery how this thing got here. And they've like, X-rayed it and taken it apart. And basically the technology to do this is not available for like maybe another 1,000 or 2,000 years later. So, but this is evidence that at least advanced clock making was available much earlier than we had thought. Now they did an analysis of this thing, and they figure out that it's actually a calculator of like orbits. So you can calculate the position of planets, and it also does things like figure out when like it'll mark off every 4 years, like the Olympics. So they say that this is like the first mechanical computer that they've ever found. So it had things in the front, it had things in the back.
Does it say where they found it?
Yeah, it does. It says that it was found in a shipwreck, found in 1902 off the coast of the Greek island. And this thing has like Greek inscriptions on it. You know, they mention things like Zeus and stuff like that. I think one of the more interesting things that they did note was that the calculations that it made were accurate according to the theories in place at the time, which actually I think predated even Ptolemy and Copernicus's things. So it does have some inaccuracy. So it's not more accurate than what might have been known at that time. So it kind of matches up with theories of the time, warts and all, which would still indicate that, it was built by some person with at that time. But still, there's the technology required to create this brass creation was not known to exist during this time period. So is that evidence that we had advanced metalworking well before we knew about it, well before we could create this? Now, obviously, these days we can easily recreate a clock like that. That is well within our technological prowess, and there's nothing spacemen like about this technology. It's just gears and stuff, but the precision at which it is made is surprising. So that is one thing. So what do you guys think of that one? Or could this be just a bunch of hooey and a massive hoax? So, Michael, you're raising your hand. Now, if you want to talk,
to me, it's just another example of how these ancient technology groups are trying to illustrate to primitive man or early man who is not scientific the benefits of advanced civilization and how they should try to develop their civilizations so that they can get to where they can do things like that.
Well, it seems to me like a common theme is that a lot of these ancient things do have to do with solar calendars and things like that. They have to do with astronomy. So definitely this would once again fall into astronomy, which has to do with what's going out in space. So I'm not sure what the importance is of figuring out, where the planets are at any given moment. Perhaps in the ancient world, that was very significant, looking up the skies and being able to figure out what's where or where it's going to be, or to predict things like solar eclipses and things like that. Seems to be a theme. So, but let's look at some other stuff here.
Yeah, I think you're right, Franklin. Back in those times, the motion of the planets was kind of like was kind of like the big thing back then, the big scientific thing to do back then.
So here's another thing that I found here. Now, some people think that the Sphinx and the actual pyramids themselves are actually much older than what Egyptologists would give them credit for. So instead of being, maybe 4,000 or 5,000 years old, some people think that these things are something on the order of like 30,000 years old. So it would be impressive that they would have been able to build something like this, say 5,000 or 6,000 years ago. It is almost outrageous to think that these things have been around for, say, 30,000 years, and they do that based on the kind of weathering that they see around the enclosure of the Sphinx. Because it looks like there's been a lot of water erosion that's happened to cause this. Like in this picture, in the lower side here, it looks like like what you might see, say, in the Grand Canyon, where you have a lot of weathering of the walls here with little rivulets going down there. So some people think that this was built a long time ago, carved out of the sandstone bedrock. Yes, Michael, you had a comment?
Well, I think it's all part of the same theme that I'm saying is that they're trying to show, they're trying to use their ether technology to create levitation, to show people that what can be done, and to keep early man on the track of developing his civilization to where he can do things like that, because they want to stay a cult, because earthly man is on his own and he has to work. Earthly man has to work out their own existence or their own karma, and so they stay a cult, except for showing us what can be done, so that we want to do it and advance ourselves.
Well, I wonder what they think of us now. I think we're pretty advanced now. Now we could actually build stuff like this, but
but we don't have that technology that they have. We can't levitate things, for example. We can't make stone, light like etheric or something. And we're not in the true ancient cosmic technology. We're not into that, because we have to do it ourselves, because they want to stay a cult, and if we do it, we have to do it ourselves.
Well, I would say that nowadays we can do things which are like that and actually much greater. Like around here in Seattle, they're building light rail transit, and this involves like building these elevated sections that are going all over the city. And if you look at that, they've got these huge sections of concrete weighing, thousands of tons, just springing up all over the place. So if you were looking in on our society and you saw all that stuff, you might think that's kind of mysterious, right? In fact, there was this one movie called Pompeii on Elliott Bay, where they had the premise was that Seattle got like buried with like a gigantic ash fall from Mount Rainier, and then thousands of years later they unearthed the city, and they find like these huge elevated freeways on top of columns, and they're wondering what these ancient people had built these things for. It's like, so if you look at it that way, then we as a society have advanced to the point where we do a lot of major constructions, and it's actually still kind of a mystery to me, because when I see them building this stuff, whenever I drive by, no matter what time of the day, even the middle of the day, it looks like there are like 12 people working on the thing. And of those 12 people, there seem to be like a group of 5 people, of which only one of the people has actually a tool in their hand. It appears to be doing something, and the other 4 are just standing around watching them. So I have no idea. It seems like kind of a mystery right there. How is it they can build these gigantic bridge structures or whatnot with so few people working on them, but yet they just seem to pop up every single day. There seems to be progress, and I just don't see how that happens. So in some ways, these things might look mysterious to us, but even what's going up around us right now seems to be kind of mysterious. Since I would expect that if you're building a gigantic bridge, that there should be thousands of people working on it, slaving away 24 hours a day. But I don't see that. It just seems to mysteriously pop up. I think that there is this thing about the Freemasons. This is the guys who have the Masonic Lodge, and they supposedly hold all the building secrets. I'm kind of thinking they still hold all the building secrets, and that somehow they build all this stuff at night when no one's around to see it. So yes, Michael, you had another comment?
Well, I think that basically my model is that they have an etheric technology, which is uses elemental ether units, which are linear and non-thermal, and we have this quantum technology, and I think theirs is easier and better, but we can't. We have to discover it on our own because they want to stay a cult, and earthly man is on his own and has to do it himself. That's what I think.
Yeah, I'm kind of wondering whether there is a non-interference. I think that was the prime directive in Star Trek. You shall not interfere with local civilization's progress. I'm kind of wondering whether there really is such a global galactic law such that the humans have to basically figure it out on their own, versus them just giving us the technology and say, there you go, right? So let's see here, getting to the pyramids. So the pyramids themselves are said to be some sort of giant electric plant of some sort. And so these things may be much older than we think they are, possibly tens of thousands of years. And there are some reasons for believing that this was not a tomb-like structure like most people would think, because no tombs have ever really been found inside of the pyramids. I mean, there was one thing that looked like a box that had been broken, but it wasn't really consistent with any of the things that they would typically do with pyramids. So there's like a diagram of what what's inside the pyramid, which generally speaking appears to be completely solid, except for a few passages. And there are some theories that what these things are basically like microwave waveguides. So if you ever see microwave waveguides, that's kind of what these things look like the way the passageway that has the main stairway in it kind of looks like a waveguide. And there's some theories that this was perhaps water powered, that that this chamber down in the bottom would flood and could generate power. And although once again, this thing is connected to the stars, and that these shafts are pointed at very specific points, stars in the sky that were aligned exactly to these points at the time they think the pyramids were built. Of course, it's really questionable when the pyramids were built, so I'm not quite sure how they could make that conclusion. And people tend to try and tie this back to like the work that Tesla did, which was that you can transmit power around the world through the earth. And that perhaps that is what they were doing, that these pyramids are located in what they say is the basically the center of the land masses. So you could balance all the land masses basically in the location where the pyramid is, which I don't quite understand since the world is round. I mean, I think they explain it, but if you get a map and you flatten the world out and then you draw an X in like the center of gravity of that's where you'll find the pyramids. But it is amazing that they were able to build such a thing. One of the more interesting theories that I've heard is that this thing is actually built out of basically a concrete-like block. So instead of having to move these gigantic blocks one at a time, they were actually cast in place. So they would just have to, get like a powder, like cement, pour it into a mold, and then wait for that to set, and then do the next one. So that would kind of explain the precision at which these blocks were put together, because they didn't have to be cut, perhaps. But who knows if that's right? Does anyone else have any comments on pyramid power? I was wondering, Bill, do you know anything about pyramid power? Did you have any comments?
There are a number of things that are of interest that I have found about the pyramids. One is on the base of the pyramids, they have figures or diagrams or pictures, and they show they're using electrical means to cure disease. And we are just rediscovering that in the modern times. And they used the father of medicine, the Greek, he also used fish, electrical eels, and things of that sort to get power to cure people's diseases. And it's interesting that the medical community does not like this, and they have managed to keep it quiet, even though Hippocrates, the father of modern medicine, is one of the first to recorded it for us, besides the sides of the pyramids. By the way, the same group that produced the pyramids in Egypt also went across the Atlantic Ocean and did some pyramids in South America and the area between South America and North America. And it's interesting, those are actually, one of those is bigger than the pyramids in Egypt. And the question is, how did they, we know where the rock quarries were that they took the rocks from and cut them, but how did they cut them so precisely, and because they were big, and raise them up to the heights that some of them are? And that is kind of a mystery. Of people had various ideas on how they might have done it, but even with our modern technology, we can't do that yet.
So, Pal, you had a comment?
Yes, I thought I will share with you my experience with the pyramids, because it was quite an ordeal. First of all, it was a very long time ago, so I may not have all of the details correct. But it was in 1961, I was traveling by an Italian Laura Line ship from someplace in South India. And on the West Coast was the departure, rather than the East Coast. At any rate, as the ship was about to cross the canal, I guess it was the Suez Canal, and they gave us the option. They said, "Listen, if you like, our crossing the canal will take about 24 hours, including wait time and everything." And so I took the option, and they said, and we can take you in the same time, go to the pyramid have you look around and climb up if you want, climb down if you want, which was very tough ordeal. And as I was going up, because I took that option, I couldn't turn it down. As I was going up, there were, and I was not alone. There were about half a dozen to maybe 10 people more with me who at least started to climb all the way. But I'm not so sure all of them made it to all the way. As we were going up, almost everybody who was coming down told us, don't go up there. It's not worth it. There is nothing to see. I said, yeah, it's easy for you to say when you've already been there. You've seen it. And I would be damned if I can't, climb up and say, hey, yes, I went and saw the tomb. And they said, no, you're just, it's not worth it, they said. Anyway, I did go up there, and I did walk all the way up to, and of course, most of it was just crawling on your hands and knees, and some of it was just walking in a kind of a sitting position, squatting position. And so, of course, it was challenging. But I did make it to the top. And I do remember going through the Queen's Chamber as well as the King's Chamber. And the King's Chamber was a few more steps above King's Chamber. And each one of them did have a tomb. And of course, there's not much to see in the tomb. And that's what the people were saying. Oh, there's nothing to see there. There's nothing to see there. Well, I had been to Taj Mahal dozens of times. And there I go and see the tomb every time. Both the Mumtaz, which was Shah Jahan's wife, and he built it in her honor. But when he died, the powers to be decided to put him right next to her. And so you can see both of them. And in a way, the arrangement for the pyramid was also similar, but the two weren't set close together as they are in Taj Mahal. Although they do have upper and lower level, the upper level is for tourists to see, and lower level is where the actual tombs are, which people don't bother. But one of them, I think it was the upper level, it was made of gold. And somehow all the gold disappeared. I don't know whether it was under Muslim control at that time, or by that time British or somebody else had taken over. I mean, could have been British, could have been Mughals, could even have been Hindus, but very unlikely because the time frame doesn't match too well. So it was, like I say, I don't know why people say there's nothing to see, because there is something to see, because you can at least say, hey, I went up there, it was a difficult ordeal, each one did have a tomb, whether or not there was a embalmed body in it or not, there was no way of telling. It was sealed. It was not something you could see. It's not something you could lift the cover as they would do in a viewing when somebody dies here in this country. So that's all I wanted to share with you. If you have any comments or questions, I'll still be here for a while.
Yes, I'm sharing some pictures of the interior of the pyramids here. So, for example, we have the so-called sarcophagus in the King's Chamber, And this is pretty much when they first entered the pyramids, how they found it, except hopefully without all the graffiti. But it's just this big, empty stone room, which doesn't seem to have really any kind of decoration in it. So it looks kind of industrial, is what the theorist, and that this sarcophagus was just part of the mechanism, but it was the only thing that was left that they couldn't drag out or steal or whatever. They just left this big old empty room there.
From what I remember, there was no graffiti on the walls, and this black stone thing behind it was already on top, so you couldn't lift it or see what's inside. Now it looks like you could go and peek and see, hey, it's empty. But that I did not have that privilege. But then, of course, like I say, it was more than 50 years ago. Or maybe 50, 48 maybe. I don't.
So there's some pictures of the of what's inside. So, Michael, you had another comment?
Well, the idea of levitating a stone block falls in line with my theory that the ancient technology basically involved applying etheric energy, because by doing so you would make the atoms of a stone block relatively more etheric, relatively less quantized. Well, they would still be quantumly structured, but you could quantify the application of the energy in such a way that it would become more etheric. The density would be less. It would be, in other words, levitated. And I think that's how the pyramids were built.
That's a pretty big stone block there. So. Okay, so that's the pyramids. Mystery how they managed to build that.
If you want more information about the pyramids, a lot of the big museums in Great Britain and other countries in Europe have things that they took out of the pyramids. They're on display. You know, like St. Petersburg, London, those type places. They'll have stuff that they removed from the pyramids.
But no one's removed anything that looks like a power plant.
There is a very interesting document that comes from the time of Solomon, who built the Jewish temple in Jerusalem. He married one of the daughters of Pharaoh. He had 1,000 wives. So anyway, he married one of the daughters of Pharaoh, and what he asked for his dowry was that
Yes, what did he ask for the dowry? You still there, Bill? Okay, well, going on here, here's another ancient factoid, possibly, and that is that there's evidence that nuclear wars have occurred in the past. And you know, they say this because they see like cities which appear to have glassified remains and in like a circular radius, and which still show signs of radioactivity, which kind of looks like it got hit by a nuclear weapon. And there are a number of stories in the ancient Sanskrit writings, in India's writings. There are stories of these types of weapons which sound an awful lot like atomic weapons. So, you know, there's things in the book of Genesis. They're saying that possibly the 7-year drought was due to a nuclear winter, perhaps. And in the ancient Indian texts, they say that they had flying machines called dinamas, which were used to launch powerful weapons of destruction. And the description was the earth shook, scorched by terrible heat of this weapon. Elephants burst into flames and ran to and fro in a frenzy, seeking protection from the Terria. Over a vast area, other animals crumpled to the ground. The waters boiled, and creatures residing therein also died. And we have, of course, the words from Dr. Oppenheimer when he had completed building the atomic bomb. You know, the quote that he said, "I am the destroyer of worlds," that comes from these Indian texts. And in fact, he was actually a scholar of those texts. So, you know, there's some speculation that perhaps that's where he got some of his ideas for how to build an atomic bomb and what they were capable of doing it. He was just making the old ancient Indian texts come true. But, you know, when you see things like, you know, this glassification and an actual remnants of radioactivity, you know, that seems kind of hard to refute. So this is one of these things where they're saying there's a sea of glass, like buried under centuries of dirt, where the dirt has literally been fused by intense heat into glass. And they're practically speaking identical to the ones created by the US government in the Nevada desert when they were first testing atomic bombs. So there's this story here about, in short, the government of India wanted to build a new housing community. So in the region of Rajasthan, India, an area that covers 3 square mile area, 10 miles west of Jodhpur, they surveyed the land and built houses. People moved in but started getting sick. A lot of people, when they went to find out why, they discovered the entire area was inexplicably radioactive and in a circular pattern with a very radioactively hot ground zero point, consistent with what occurs underneath a typical air burst nuclear detonation. They evacuated the area, and it is essentially a quarantined wasteland. They've also excavated entire cities where the people and their skeletons have been fossilized, frozen in time at their moment of instantaneous death, and the skeletons are radioactive. So that sounds like those people were hit by a nuclear bomb. And they're also saying that they found like evidence of ancient nuclear reactors. Basically, they found their spent fuel, and then when they tried to process it to get the uranium, they found that they couldn't because it wasn't any good for new fuel. It was already used. And that the isotope percentages were all wrong, and that it contained detectable amounts of plutonium, and is only really formed inside of breeder nuclear reactors. So perhaps they found an ancient nuclear reactor, or at least their dumping ground for their used nuclear reactor rods. So there's this experience, all of this evidence of some ancient nuclear war. And they're saying things like the crater in Arizona wasn't created by a meteor, that it was some kind of nuclear explosion, perhaps. And the big crater in Yucatan perhaps was not a meteor, but a nuclear explosion. One that may have been big enough to to create a nuclear winter, which led to the eventual downfall of the dinosaurs. And so speaking of Egyptian hieroglyphics here, so they seem to have this picture showing what appeared to be an Apache helicopter and maybe a submarine and a jet plane. Showing that maybe they knew about things like that. So they also speak of the pyramids. So it could be that nuclear war has happened before and will happen again. So what do you think of that? Did ancient men have nuclear weapons? Or at least their gods had nuclear weapons.
Some of the stuff seems like it is hard to refute, but you really don't know unless you have all the facts, I guess.
Well, we live in the modern age where anyone can post anything they want on the internet. So it comes directly from you, from them to us here about what these possibilities are. So that's possibility of ancient nuclear war. I did discuss the Sumerians. I've got a link for them. The Sumerians are supposed to be one of the very first ancient people. And they basically explain that that their gods came from basically outer space, and that the humans were the servants to the gods. That the basic idea was that they came to Earth to do things like mine for gold, which was a very, very, of course, arduous and difficult thing to do. So to have them do the work, they invented humans. And so they got the humans to go and dig for their gold, which might explain our fascination with gold, because we're just designed to go find it and collect it, according to the Sumerian creation theory. So in that case, that could explain why, they find these things which are much older than recorded history, because man was created well before what we would call our recorded history. Our recorded history only goes back something like 5,000 or 6,000 years.
Franklin,
Yes, pal.
doesn't somehow the Big Bang qualify as a nuclear weapon?
Does a what qualify as a nuclear weapon?
Big Bang, 13.8 billion years ago.
No, I don't think the Big Bang would qualify as a nuclear weapon. It's certainly not a weapon. The Big Bang is what mainstream currently thinks how the universe was created. So the Big Bang is an act of creation, not an act of destruction. Although I haven't heard about anybody having a myth of the Big Bang. So a lot of these, what people will point out is that if you look at the legends that a lot of ancient cultures have, they're similar to the Sumerians, where they indicate that there was some god who came from the sky that basically created humanity. That seems to be a bit somewhat common in the mythology, similar to what the Sumerians are suggesting.
You would think, though, that if any of these things had really any credence, that there would have been somebody in the last 100 years, some organization or maybe a school or something like that, that would have taken up interest in them, that would have studied them and did scientific evaluations of them and made an announcement that they believed that they were true.
Well, I think nowadays you would call that the television series Ancient Aliens. If you've ever watched them, that's exactly what they do. They go around and they talk to the relevant experts, and they do like experiments. Like they'll take, like they found a particular shape of like a supposed ancient aircraft or something, and they'll put it in a wind tunnel, and they'll say, yeah, it's perfectly stable. It could have flown. Stuff like that is what they'll do. And of course, they're announcing, that all these things are true all the time. That they're like a TV show.
Right. I'm saying, like, if a university did a study on it, and I don't know, maybe the universities wouldn't allow the students to actually officially back something like this. That could be too. Because they'd be worried about their own reputation.
That's why I like watching the show Ancient Aliens. That last time I think they had a whole program on whether the United States and Russia have been collaborating on like the alien encounters ever since Roswell and stuff like that. So they'll bring up things like that like a year after or a year before Roswell incident, the Russians had a similar incident where they actually shot down one of these UFOs, and they captured prisoners alive and things like that. But that the United States and Russia have been in cahoots this whole time concerning the presence of aliens on the planet. So, Michael, go ahead and chime in anytime. You don't have to raise your flag.
Well, I think as far as atomic explosion on Earth, I think that would be just a routine thing for these ether technology groups, because if they are behind the scenes of earthly man, then that would be part of a cosmic management thing, where they would be most likely controlling things like quasars or chaotic cosmic things going on, where they'd have to use their technology to control those things, to keep an order of the cosmos so that everything is more or less in order and entities can exist despite these quasars or whatever chaotic event might occur. That you have these, part of their job is to take care of the cosmos, and another part is to supervise earthly man. I think it's all part of the same thing.
And I'm kind of wondering, where are they now? What are they doing? Do they care what we're doing?
Well, yeah, but we have to do it on our own. We have to determine what we want and do it ourselves, and that they can show us certain things, but they can't show us everything. They can't determine what we want. We have to figure out what we want to do, what our role is. It has to be our decision.
Or it's just a matter of one of us stupid humans coming up with the right answer, right? I mean, I suppose that here in the CNPS, a lot of people, that's why they're into it, because they think that they have uncovered the secrets of the universe, and they need to work on getting it out. And At least that's what I believe. Okay, and someday when my genius is recognized, then I will be able to say I told you so. But the question is if there's an overseeing alien presence, and what is their role in either promoting technology or suppressing it? Because we always kind of hear in the CNPS, we're always kind of complaining about how mainstream basically suppresses anything that sounds remotely interesting to us, and they keep on promoting theories which basically get us nowhere. That's why people tend to diss Einstein around here, because ever since 1905. Pretty much we haven't really made a whole heck of a lot of progress in the physical sciences. So is that because we as humans can't handle it, and our alien overseers are suppressing any attempt to get to the correct technology, or that's just us? So more speculation. Now, what I've always thought was that, and this is one of my main criticisms of this whole theory, is that if these aliens did exist with their technology so long ago, then why haven't we found any of their, say, communications technology? Why haven't we found, say, an ancient radio or a cell phone or a computer or, anything like that? Because we know in order to do stuff like that, certainly you would need to be, any ancient alien would need to, or even people, even if there weren't aliens, even if it was just technologically advanced humans, that they would need to have certainly communications devices. And so far, we really haven't found any evidence of that, except there was this supposed picture here that they dug up there. See, there you go. There is an ancient cell phone. Surprisingly, it looks like a Nokia cell phone. So this picture kind of went viral all over the network, and it's the only thing I could really find about anybody digging up any evidence of something that looks like advanced technology from some ancient time. So this went around the internet for a while, although this particular article concludes that this so-called artifact was actually made by an artist who kind of specializes in recreating ancient artifacts kind of thing. So I think they finally did pin this down as being a relatively recent creation, since they couldn't pin down exactly who dug this thing up and where it came from and all that. But so this was probably a hoax. So just to let you know, guys, you can't believe everything you see on the internet. But I kind of feel that the other thing is that if these people were so advanced, then wouldn't they use the same kind of building methods that we currently modern people use, which is like basically steel and concrete buildings? I would think that if that were the case, then we should see like these evidence of these like multi-story buildings, but we don't see anything like that. What we instead see are buildings made out of, say, gigantic stone blocks, which would seem to be kind of the hardest way to do it, and that's kind of impractical for making a large building.
Well, if etheric energy is basically different from our quantum energy, that would make their materials different.
Possibly. So the only solutions around this I can figure is that if all of their high technology stuff was actually, say, organic in nature, so that their communication devices were like made entirely of, say, plastic or something like that. So all of their high technology stuff would have eventually degraded. Eventually, I mean, our technology is kind of heading in that direction, where it used to be we used to have these big old vacuum tubes made out of big pieces of metal, and then we're getting into integrated circuits, which are still packaged, and now we're getting into things like organic LEDs, where we're no longer really even using transistors anymore. So it could get to the point where, and they're trying to get to things like plastic screens. It could get to the point where your entire computer could possibly be made out of organic materials, such that or either that, they just don't even need these kind of technologies for some reason. And it could also be that there's been sufficient disasters and ice ages and such that would possibly wipe out any evidence of anything other than something made out of gigantic stone blocks. So if the ice age came and it came over Seattle, and Seattle was buried under like 2 miles of ice, then it could possibly completely scrape off any evidence of an advanced building technique. And the other thing is that there are probably just a lot less people back then, and so maybe there just wasn't the need to build a gigantic building because there are only a dozen people around at the time. But I'm still waiting for them to dig up an actual ancient cell phone. They're going to find some chamber in the pyramids that contains just a whole storeroom of electronics. That's what I'm looking for. All right, so now we're getting into ancient anti-gravity. So we have ancient secrets of the megaliths and anti-gravity revealed. So this is one of the theories saying that they were able to build things because they had a way of turning these blocks into turning off the gravity. So they would transport 3,000-ton rock blocks by towing them with ropes and haul them up 40 meters by some unknown method. And this is what seems to be common about these ancient megaliths, and that they're all built out of just ginormous, tightly fitting stones. So here's an example of the stonework in Peru. Although to me, this kind of looks like this design was like carved into what was previously a solid block, but apparently not. I mean, you can see the grains run in different directions, so it couldn't possibly have been from the same block. And they just managed to fit all these stones in there just perfectly. I believe the story behind this is that some people think that they had some kind of technology that actually melted the rocks or something, or molded them so that they could just be like putty and they could just stick them so close together. And ancient peoples just like making things like Stonehenge. And I believe that the hypothesis on this website is that they use some kind of property of static electricity in order to do this levitation. Now, me personally, I think gravity is actually a static force. It's electrostatic in nature. So I think, yeah, if you could figure out how to reverse the electric force, then you would have a way of reversing gravity. I mean, clearly you can overcome the force of gravity with static electricity. So if I take a comb and rub it in my hair, then I can easily pick up things like paper and stuff like that, easily overcoming the force of gravity. But there are a number of other stories. And so one example that we have is of a modern megalithic construction, and this is called the Coral Castle. And this was built by like a 100-pound guy called Edward Leedskin from 1923 to 1951. You know, single-handedly carved over 1,000 tons of coral rock and built this very mysterious coral castle. And what was more amazing is that he decided to just pick the whole thing up and move it to its current location. Once again, without anybody seeing what he was doing or how he did it. And you know, these stones weigh tons. So it's a bit of a mystery as to how he did it. I mean, there are some people who said that they had witnessed Ed doing this, and he was basically levitating the giant blocks as he was placing them on the truck that he was going to use to go move all these stones. And but then there are other people who say that what Ed did was just due to knowledge of levers and blocks. And they have books saying that, you know, everything that Ed did was just a matter of knowing how to exploit leverage and time. So you could see how he might have been able to do that. You know, if you take a long lever and you put cribbing underneath a gigantic block, you know, you can raise it pretty much as high as you want. I mean, it takes a while, but it can be done, even probably by a single person. So some people think that that it was done that way. Other people think that he had some mysterious electromagnetic method. There was like a tripod and a box and some strange electrical looking stuff in his workshop. But this stands as an enigma in the modern world, in that one of these megalithic structures was apparently created in modern times. So has anyone actually seen the Coral Castle? I'm gonna have to go visit that thing someday. No? So I see Cornelius, you have joined us. You were disappointed last week that we didn't explore the topic here, so I was kind of wondering, what are your thoughts? No, not in the speaking mood? Okay. All right, so that's the Coral Castle.
On the road, Franklin. I'm not in a position to speak.
All right. So let's just look at one of these books on Amazon here. So here apparently is the instruction guide for how one man created the megalithic wonder. So if they claim that no supernatural powers or abilities were used, then that means that perhaps all these other megalithic structures that we see created in the past are perhaps not that amazing. That it could have been done with just the knowledge of blocks and levers and pulleys and that sort of thing. But I don't think that's nearly as cool. So
I think that's more probable, though.
yeah, more probable.
And as far as your you were mentioning the before about not really coming up with a whole lot of good theories since 1905. I kind of think part of the reason for that is that we got so much technology available to us now that I think we're a lot less creative, and our minds don't work as hard because they don't need to as much as they did way back then. So I think in some ways they used their minds a lot more than we do in nowadays, because their minds weren't as lazy as ours have gotten with the technology that we have. Or maybe they were more creative, because they were pretty advanced in mathematics and geometry back then, a lot more than most even college students are today. And I think that's due to us having so much technology that we can't really focus on something and be really good at it like they were back then, like in math and geometry.
I mean, that could be. Maybe we're sitting on our hands because as soon as they invented electricity and Tesla figured out how to transmit power, that we didn't have to do things like figure out what, say, gravity is or how magnets work, which are still very large, outstanding questions in science. But, if we could figure out how gravity worked, then, maybe we could reverse it, and then we could go build gigantic things like the pyramids without any problem because we could reverse gravity or neutralize it or something like that. Because I would say of all the science questions that remain outstanding, the nature of how any of the attractive or repulsive forces work is still a major question mark, which is what people here in the CNPS, like myself, are working on trying to answer that particular question, that's why we tend to discuss topics about gravity or atomic physics, or forces or ether, because all of those get to the basic question of why things might attract each other or repel each other or stick together, and what's their geometric form. But in the meanwhile, we invented or found out the concept behind radio and electricity and mechanics a long time ago, and maybe we're just sitting on our hands, or maybe it's the aliens who are suppressing the technology because we're just not ready for it. So, but it's interesting that while these things might have been invented by ancient aliens, maybe they were just constructed using conventional mechanics, such that even one little guy could create this gigantic coral castle weighing thousands of tons. Although I don't know, I don't think any single person would be able to do all of that and then basically move it without using a lot of heavy construction vehicles, really. So I find that hard to believe. So
how long it took too? Does the article state how long of the time period it took?
Yeah, there's a time period. I mean, it wasn't that long. I believe the original website there said, 1923 to 1951. I know that's like 30 years or so.
That's believable.
I mean, as a single person, you can get some work done. It just might be slow. Like once I demolished a manufactured old mobile home, and I was just like an ant, chewing away at it like a little bit at a time, one screw at a time, one handful of insulation at a time, cutting one beam at a time, versus what a conventional demolition guy would have done. He would have just brought in a tractor crane and just crunched the whole thing up and thrown it into a dumpster, versus basically a slow deconstruction, right? But it can get done that way. One guy working steadily can get work done. So it's either Ed had some magical mystical powers, or he just was a hard worker. So he says he discovered the secrets of the Egyptian pyramids, which was just a bunch of levers and ropes and blocks. Let's see, we were also talking about levitation here. So one of the stories from ancient legend is this notion of the acoustic levitation of stones. And so basically I have this diagram here. And what they would do is they would have all these musicians arranged in a precise geometry. And then when they all got going, they would put this rock in this certain spot, and it would cause the rock to levitate up to the point where they needed it. So they would build like these monasteries, like, hundreds and hundreds of feet up on a cliff. And this is how they get the rocks up there. Yes, the Tibetan monks levitate the stones using an acoustic levitation technique with the aid of drums. So this is one possible way for them to do levitation somehow, although it's kind of questionable as to what sound has to do with gravity. Now, in my own personal pet theories, I feel that gravity is an electrostatic attraction to the Earth, and that's because everything has dipoles in it. And when you put a dipole in an electric field, the dipole turns to face that electric field. And because of that, that is what actually, there's a slight imbalance between the positive and negative, since, like, say, the negative pole is closer than the positive pole. So that creates an imbalance in the force, and that is what actually creates the downward force. So you only experience gravity only as long as the dipole is aligned with the electric field. But if you are somehow to be able to get the dipoles to not be aligned with the electric field, then they would no longer feel any gravitational pull. So if you turn them like 90 degrees, the electric field somehow, then it should theoretically become weightless. So my only speculation is that somehow these sounds generate a vibration through the material such that it screws up the alignment of the dipoles. That if you get like a certain resonance going, that perhaps causes all the dipoles to get randomized, and then you should be able to levitate things. But, that's only my random speculation on how this might work. So, Michael, I'm sure you have a speculation on how this works.
I don't,
So how
I
do
don't
you,
know if I put much faith in this article.
pardon?
I don't know if I put much faith in this particular article with the acoustics.
You wouldn't put your faith in this article?
It seems too hard to believe.
It's too hard to believe.
Well,
Well,
the simple explanation is that the atoms of the object that's being levitated are less dense, and the etheric components of the atom are more active, and the resonance is such that it's become more etheric, and that's why it's lighter. Because it's still quantally structured, but relatively it's less quantized and relatively more etheric in terms of its internal etheric components.
well, you say that, but that's a little bit vague, I suppose. I mean, I might be able to understand it in terms of, let's say that you have your ether and it's surrounding the rock. Now, typically the rock is denser than air, so therefore, it sinks.
Well,
Just
the ether is also inside the object that's being levitated, and etheric elemental ether units are everywhere. They're universal. They're outside. They're inside the atoms. They form quantum units by entrainment and then linkages, and then if you alter that etheric structure of the atoms of the object in such a way that the etheric component becomes more, and the quantum structure becomes relatively less, the object will become lighter.
Well, that's what I was trying to explain. I mean, a lot of what you're saying, I think, is like hand waving, but to make it a little bit more precise, basically you take the stone block, let's say it was immersed in water, and you can see that that would sink. But if you were to somehow make your stone block made out of foam, then you would immediately see it rise. And so that's the kind of effect I think you're talking about, where you change the density of the object relative to its surrounding, because that's what buoyancy is really based upon. And one of the things that I've noted is that people think that gravity is only an attraction only kind of force, but actually that's not true. I mean, if I take a helium balloon and I let it go, I mean, what's going on there? I mean, some people would claim that that's buoyancy, but what exactly is buoyancy? What really appears to be happening is that the force placed upon an object by a gravity field really depends more upon the surrounding medium that it's in. So if you have an object which is less dense than the surrounding medium, then the force of gravity actually works in the opposite direction. That it is actually a repelling force from the gravitational center rather than an attracting force. Now, I know that that would be a little bit difficult for most people to stomach, that there's actually an active repelling force, but there is some suggestions in like the way that I conceive how gravity works, which is, like I said, is a dipole type of force, that shows that is exactly what would happen. That due to the differences in permittivity and permeability, that the surrounding medium would in fact cause a particle to be repelled from the force going in the opposite direction, rather than it being something like buoyancy, where we think the object is being pushed up from basically the bottom of the object. So, for example, if you can imagine, you take like a beach ball And if you ever done this, you try and put the beach ball under the water. So we are to believe that just the difference in pressure between the bottom of the beach ball and the top of the beach ball is enough to produce that force. You know, and there are some calculations you can do that would suggest that that's kind of the way it works, but it certainly doesn't feel that way. It feels like there's a massive force of that air actually pulling upwards is what's happening, and not due to just all of the force of the beach ball pushing up. I mean, I have had some interesting discussions on this, and it kind of leads to the thing like if you had like a cube, and theoretically, if you took this cube and you put it in an aquarium and you pushed it down to the bottom of the aquarium and you were able to squeeze out all of the water between the cube and the bottom of the aquarium, then theoretically that cube should just stick on the bottom of the aquarium. It shouldn't float up because there would be no water pressure to push it up, according to our conventional theories of buoyancy. Now, I personally think that would be a whole lot of hooey. I think that there's no way you'd be able to keep that air-filled cube at the bottom of the aquarium, even if you managed to exclude all the water that was underneath it. I would think that it would still just jump to the surface. But I just put that out as an interesting observation about gravity, that it may not always be all attracting. And the next time you see a helium balloon go fly by, that may actually be a demonstration of anti-gravity. But let's see here. So, but last week, we discussed, Michael Antesky's here, theory of the ether, which you mentioned quite a bit during our little talk here. So I was wondering, had you given any thought about how you're interpreting your theory? Because you said that you had gotten this from the Declaration of Independence, and you were trying to interpret that. And towards the end of the meeting, I had suggested that your interpretations could go along with, say, the positron-electron C theory of the ether. So I was wondering whether you had thought about that.
Well, it was code breaking of a code that's enciphered into the Declaration, and supposedly that's coming out of the horse's mouth, out of the technology, otherworldly technology that uses an ether in their technology as their technology. And as far as antiparticles, I believe, were creationally channeled toward black holes creationally because they followed a like unit pathway through the ether matrix, where they could be directed creationally into a black hole. Otherwise, how can you explain the absence of antiparticles in the universe? There's no other way. It's the only possible way. I mean, even hypothetically, there's no. You just throw up their hands. Standard quantum theory just throws up their hands at the question.
No, not really. I mean, if you think that the antiparticles are just the positrons, then anytime you see a positive charge, that's the result of a positron. So basically, all of the antimatter positrons would be locked up in the protons. So the proton just being two positrons and an electron. So if you think of it that way, see, then all of the antimatter and matter is actually accounted for in even numbers, because most of the matter, all the matter that we see around us is neutrally charged, and the only way that can be neutrally charged is if there are equal numbers of matter and antimatter composing them. So it's really the only thing that separates antimatter from matter is actually just its opposite charge. So if you have a proton, that's a +1 charge. We have made things antiprotons, which are exactly the same as protons, except they have a negative charge. So all those antiparticles are just locked up into the protons. So that would be my feeling on that. What do you think of that hypothesis?
Well, I'm not a quantist, and I don't think most quantum theorists have that theory. I think they're mystified at what happened to antiparticles and why they're not present in the universe, because every time they generate a proton, a particle, an antiparticle is immediately generated as well. So I can't really take. I'm not a quantum theorist. You're coming from a different direction, and my direction is coming from the ether. The ether is all particles are composed of ether units, which entrain and link up, and eventually.
Yeah. So I mean, I was kind of wondering. So this is what the question I posed to you, which is, couldn't your ether units just be made out of a positron-electron pair? I mean, it sounds like it based on almost everything you said about yin and yang and about it being opposite, and that you talk a lot about waves, and all of that is absolutely consistent with your ether particle being made out of a positron-electron.
No, that's different. It's different. What you're saying is different. Elemental ether units were the first primordial units that were formed in the very beginning of the universe, and they're universal. They're identical. Everything else is made out of those ether units that were the first things that appeared after the universal oscillation.
I understand that, but I'm saying that perhaps you are mistaken about that. I'm wondering, what did you read in your code that suggested to you that the fundamental ether unit was this just fundamental ether unit versus
they're
electron?
Abysmally smaller than quantum units. I mean, if you're talking about positrons or electrons or anything like that, there's no comparison with these elemental ether units. There's so much more rarefied that there's just no way to correlate them with observations of quantum systems and saying, well, could this be the ether? Could that be the ether? We just can't detect the ether. It's too rarefied. And just when the elemental units are entrained and link up and eventually form a larger unit and eventually a quantum unit, and we observe these quantum phenomena, but that's not the ether itself. The ether is vibratory, and these quantum dynamics are spin vector systems.
Well, I'm wondering, where did you? I mean, does your source really indicate that? Because I think perhaps you have misinterpreted your source to think that.
Well, it goes back to the beginning where you had a universal oscillation, and then it converted into a vibratory ether. The oscillations converted to a vibration.
Is that your idea, or is that an idea that you got from the Declaration of Independence decode?
Yeah, from the decode. The first you had a universal oscillation, then you had oscillatory fatigue, and then you had yin yang, and then yin yang oscillating pairs would have necessarily had to reversibly revert to singleton units, and when they did that, they would have fallen out of phase with the universal oscillation, which would have broken the perfect symmetry of original space. And then from there on, it was an ether, and that's what space is now. It's an ether with small spaces in between, allowing for the vibrations to take place. Or originally, it was the oscillations that needed a little additional empty space. So that's what space is now. And so that's completely different from quantum systems, which operate by spin vector mechanisms, and it's two different things, really. Once
again, the problem with your theory is that it's based on the fundamental ether unit, which can't be found. So you'll never be able to prove your theory if you can't find the very thing in which everything is fundamentally based upon.
Well, the only way to prove it would be to generate a selectively etheric energy field and predict that it would decrease density of objects in the field. In other words, would levitate objects within the field test that you set up, in which you have this etheric energy, and then that wouldn't absolutely prove it, but it would be very strong evidence producing a predicted effect of decreased density and levitation in such a system. And then the codes that I work with actually describe such a way you could do it, but it would be quite expensive, and I haven't found anybody that to financially sponsor the field test that I would need to do that.
I mean, I don't know that would necessarily prove it. I mean, it
would be very strong evidence, though.
You mentioned like all kinds of perhaps other ways of levitating things. Like I could say that levitation would happen. Like, for example, one thing I might predict is that if I took something and I provided it with a sufficiently high positive charge, that it would levitate simply because the Earth is a positively charged body. So you create any sufficiently highly charged positive body, it will cause it to repel.
Levitation isn't something that happens very often. I mean, if you predict it, and then you produced it according to this certain setup that you would have, that would be pretty strong evidence, I think.
I mean, I've kind of produced evidence like that. One of the experiments that I did to try and do that was that, I had a Van de Graaff generator that generates a very strong positive field. And if you sit there and you generate these positively charged soap bubbles, so I just held a soap bubble gun in my hand while attached to a Van de Graaff generator. And what I did notice was that in an open area, the soap bubbles had a tendency to rise, as if they were filled with helium, perhaps, versus if I was not charged, then the bubbles would have a tendency to just drift down. So their behavior is very different when they have a positive charge. I also tried doing things like charging them negatively, and that seemed to make them drop to the ground as well. So I have some evidence that this kind of levitation, but you can only levitate very, very light things. I mean, clearly, when you're using a Van de Graaff generator, you can levitate things like foam peanuts quite easily. You can have a foam peanut, being attracted to the Van de Graaff generator from beneath. That's quite easy to do. There are also other classic demonstrations with Van de Graaff generators. You put a stack of pie plates on top of the Van de Graaff generator. When you turn the thing on, they just all go flying off.
Yeah, but the setup that I would want to do would be designed specifically to produce an etheric field with unique parameters in the protocol of setting up this experiment, which would be different from the kind of experiments that you're describing, which are, basically different design and different way of going about it, producing the levitation. I mean.
Yeah, but they're doable. I mean, but this goes back to a basic problem that I think a lot of dissident theorists have, in that they make a postulate or hypothesis, and based on that hypothesis, they justify their theory. So, for example, if I'm having this problem where I'm losing my socks in my dryer, I could make the hypothesis that little leprechauns are coming around and stealing my laundry when I'm not looking. Okay, so I can make that hypothesis, and it perfectly matches what my experimental result is, which is that I appear to have socks which are missing, right? So because I see the socks missing and that matches the hypothesis, then that must mean my hypothesis is true, right? So there must really be little green leprechauns stealing my socks, is what's going on.
I can't go into all the details of this test because otherwise I'd be giving it away and then I wouldn't be in it anymore. I'd be, just.
No, I think you should give it away. That's what my other point is, that I just really can't stand these people who make this secrecy claim, because you need collaborators. So I really got to doubt almost anyone who has these kind of secrecy claims, that if this meant anything to you, that you would publish it freely. That's what I do. Everything that I've got is out on my website, franklinwho.com. It's been out there for the past 13 years. Still nobody cares, but it's all out there, and I'm just waiting for someone to who has the means and the other knowledge to either confirm, to help me confirm it or whatever. Because I'm not at all concerned about someone else getting the credit or whatnot. I'm more concerned about advancing science as we know it. So, if someone grabs a hold of my stuff, completely steals it, and gains the Nobel Prize, then I'll still be happy, because I knew that say, the theory of like how the atom is formed, or whatever theory I happen to be working on, was successful and managed to get out into the mainstream.
Well, the field test that I would design not I did design, but the one I got from the code breaking would use natural earth materials, would not use technological instrumentations, except maybe to measure density. So it would be quite different. It'd be completely different from our familiar technologies of measuring quantum dynamic systems. That's about all I can say about it, really.
But once again, the theories that you have, like you say, things are entrained and stuff like that. It's like, that is just way too vague to actually constitute.
Well, how can the ether produce larger units like quantum units or intermediate ethereal units, except by entrainment and linkages of the elemental ether units?
Yeah, but how do things link? I mean, do they link like Lego bricks or what?
Well, they vibrate, and the outward vibrations contact each other, and they resonate in that way across a small distance, that empty space distance between the elemental units.
Well, you see, that sounds exactly the same that's almost identical to how I describe how things attract, except that you don't have a real mechanism for why vibrations should cause attractions.
Well, if you take quantum entanglement, the idea is that elemental ether units make up the ether matrix, and they also are the fundamental building blocks of the quantum units that are supposedly entangled. And the only logical way you can explain it is with the ether theory that I have, that there's a vibrational mechanism involved, which is a simple resonant type of resonance, and
yeah, but that still doesn't explain why, because if I have two vibrating things here, logically there is no reason for them to be attracted to each other because they're vibrating. Just because you're saying that, I'm saying that you don't have any real reason for why that might happen. Although,
well, if you look at quantum entanglement, there's no way to explain it with quantum physics, and this ether model that I have explains it very, very simply and very directly. And
well, I would claim, based on what you're saying, that it doesn't, because if that's really all you've got, then quantum entanglement just means that I have this like red and white square, and then when I separate them, I go look at this white square and I say the other square must be red. It's red, so that must be quantum entanglement. So see, when you talk quantum entanglement, that still doesn't tell me anything about why these two particles should come together and form a unit. You see, now
what other way could they be connected?
I'm going to give my example, how I explain that, because you see, once again, everything that you're saying is absolutely correct, in that there is vibrations. Vibrations are, in fact, very important to why, two particles should come together and attract. So this is my explanation, okay? So I just want you to have an open mind, because I'm explaining to you basically what's underlying your theory, right? That there is a vibration, and these vibrations cause things to attract, right? Now you would welcome
not things, but elemental ether units. They're not things. They're elemental ether units, which are universal. They everything from the original element. Everything is built up from elemental ether units. They were the first things that appeared after the oscillation converted into an ether.
Yeah, the thing is that can be right, and you interpreted that right. But what you're interpreting wrongly is what those elemental ether particles are. You think they are something fundamental and different than particles we can observe.
Well, they're uniform.
I'm saying that is logically is not going to work. But let me see if I can explain this, because, like I said, what you're saying about vibrations and attracting, that is absolutely correct. But you have no true explanation for how that works. But let me explain to you how I see that working, right? It goes along with what you're explaining, but it's actually much more physically plausible, right? So this is the way I explain it. So the only thing that you have to change in your theory is to say that the fundamental ether unit is either a positron or an electron, which I would represent by, red block, positron, white block, electron, okay? That's the only change you need to add to your little theory, okay? That the fundamental unit is, in fact, the positron and electron. So the question is, why does the positron and the electron attract each other? So what I say is that each of these things have a resonant frequency. So when you hit it like a bell, it will ring at a frequency. Same thing with the positron. The only difference is that these things ring out of phase, 180 degrees out of phase. That's the only difference. So there's the vibration, there's the yin and yang in your theory, right? Yin and yang. There's the vibration in your theory, which is the resonant frequency. Now the thing is that when you have two frequencies come together and they are in phase, then those reinforce, which create a very large area of high pressure. So therefore, if I get two blocks resonating at exactly the same frequency, when their waves collide together, they make a region of high pressure, which pushes them apart, okay? So the reason why there's a force there is because you have a high pressure area and a low pressure area on the outside. That is what causes them to repel.
Oh, Franklin,
if you get two opposite,
you're trying to
just
argue.
a minute, don't interrupt me, please. Let me finish my explanation. That if you have two of the opposite, like a positron, electron, then their waves will cancel, creating an area of low pressure. Therefore, that attracts them. And this is a real physical reason for why attraction occurs. And there were people who did experiments 100 years ago to prove that this does, in fact, create attractive and repelling forces. They did experiments with pulsating balloons in water and showed that these kind of pulsings can create positive and negative things, right? So that's how you. This is your I don't know, your entrainment or your or whatever you're talking about. But once you produce,
the ether is a universal quiet purring vibratory mechanism, and it's a very simple model. It doesn't have anything to do with quantum physics or positrons or
just electrons. Saying, the thing is that all of that is incredibly vague. That your theory would be much improved if you just said that the quantum unit is in fact the electron.
Well, I'm not saying it isn't the electron, but the electrons are built up from elemental ether units.
And I'm saying that there's no evidence that the electron has ever been built out of anything. All the experimental evidence says that the electron is truly fundamental. I mean, I'm just trying to, because I'm trying to help your theory here, in that, like, what you said is right, except other than the super vague concept that, that, because if you say that the electron is made out of ether units, then you have to answer the question, like, how many and in what structure and blah, 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 and all that. Versus if you said that your fundamental ether unit was the electron, then you don't have to answer any of those questions.
Well, origin, the point of my model, a lot of it is origin, and if you have all these electrons, bunches of electrons, where did they come from? If they didn't come from.
So how did you answer? Because I answered that. I said, well, how does it matter? It doesn't matter, does it?
Well, I don't understand a model where you have an elemental electron where you don't know how they came about or where they originated from.
Well, why would you need to know it? I mean, this is my point. So I want you to try and answer this, which is we know electrons exist. You can build, if your theory is based on electrons, then does it, I mean, as long as you know they exist, then why does it matter where they come from? I mean, in a theory which states that electrons are in fact fundamental, then there is no answer to that question. That basically they exist, and that's what actually makes them fundamental. So
well,
how is it not knowing where the electron comes from? How is that a problem for anybody's theory?
I think origin is very important. To have a logical origin for something, I think, is very important.
Well, the thing is that you can keep on going down this rat hole. The rabbit hole, which is if you think the origin is important, then where is the origin of your theoretical fundamental unit? I mean, you could still ask that exact same question. You'd have exactly the same problem. So I'm asking you, so where did your ethereal unit come from?
The very first thing was a universal oscillation, which then converted to a universal ether. A vibratory ether, the oscillations converted to vibrations.
But that's illogical, because in order to have a vibration, the only way that vibrations can be mediated is through a medium, a physical medium. Without there being any physical medium, no vibration is possible. So then you would have to ask, well, where's the media for that vibration? You keep on playing this game.
Well, you only need a medium for quantum systems. For original space, you had universal oscillations with tiny spaces in between the oscillating units to allow for the oscillatory motions and the vibratory motions.
How can you have an oscillating unit without anything to be oscillating?
Well, original space was more self-compatible than space is now. Now, since the ether, it's filled with an ether now, and it's just not the same thing anymore. It is kind of hypothetical, I admit that, but if you go from that hypothesis, you can go from there to everything else logically.
No, you can't. You really can't. I mean, if you cannot explain why a positron attracts an electron, then you have not explained really anything. Right? And you can't explain that, really.
Quantum physics is a different area of theory. It involves spin, vectors. It's a different.
No, I'm just talking about just basic stuff. Why does a positron attract an electron according to the Coulomb force law?
Well, we're operating on a different ball field here.
We're operating on the Earth. It's the same ball field. You mean you're claiming that explains everything, but I'm saying that you can't explain that. You can't explain the most simple thing that happens between particles found on the Earth. So, that's a pretty big hole in your theory, wouldn't you think?
No, I don't. I'm not a quantum physicist. I can't get into that. You don't have to be quantum physics.
You can take two pith balls, charge them up positively, and you can see they attract. See, that's a macroscopic physical system which you have to be able to explain. But if you can't explain that, then I would say that you're explaining that your claim that explains everything is very false, because you cannot explain even that.
Well, I don't think that we're on the same playing on the same ball field here.
No, actually, this is what I'm trying to claim, is that we are actually playing on exactly the same ball field. Your theory is actually the same as mine. Really, I mean, the coincidences of how similar they are is, I mean, they're much more similar than they are different. Every single aspect of your theory can fit within my theory, except my theory explains it precisely. Like, I don't have a mysterious etheric unit. Instead, I replace that with the positron and the electron, which are actually the same unit, except they are running out of phase.
Well, my
And then
ether
I explained
operates
the very basic.
vibrationally, and quantum systems operate differently. They don't operate vibrationally at all. So there's two different ball fields that we're playing on.
No, like I said, same ball field. This is what I'm trying to get the point across to you. Is that my theory is, this is why I'm working with you on this, because your theory seems remarkably like my theory. The only thing that you're not accepting is that, what on earth is your fundamental ether unit. So the fundamental unit, if you accepted the electron and the positron as being your fundamental unit, like I said, then that matches your theory quite precisely. Especially the vibrational things, the vibrational component. I mean, did you understand anything about how I explained why a positron should attract an electron due to the interaction of phases?
Well, there might be similarities, but it's different. It's not the same thing as elemental ether units interacting by a vibration of identical units everywhere.
No, that is exactly that. Everything you just said, that is exactly my theory. The identical ether units interacting by vibration. And I've explained physically why that actually works. I mean, there has to be two different kind of particles for that to happen. And their interactions between their phases is what would determine either attraction or repelling. So, like I said, everything that you just said in that sentence there, you have elemental ether units interacting by vibrations. That's so similar.
They're uniform. They're not different. They're not different things. They're all the same, but they interact vibrationally, and that's how they
well, that's exactly what I said. I said that the positron and electron are actually the exact same thing, except the only difference is they're vibrating differently. And it's that vibrational phase difference which leads to the attraction.
Well, then it's different because my elemental units are vibrating the same, only they interact with each other via simple contact of their outward vibrations. And that's how they resonate.
I would say that we know that
they're the same, basically.
That absolutely doesn't work. I think that you're misinterpreting your original source. And maybe you should go back and look at that, because there's the yin and the yang part, right? There has to be something which is opposite. So they cannot be identical.
Well, their vibrations may be different and different directionally, but they're still the same kind of unit.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I would say. Positron, electron, it's exactly the same thing. Whatever they're constructed of, I would say that they must be physically the same thing. Just like these two Lego bricks are the same thing. The only difference is they're different colored, but chemically, they're exactly the same thing. Just this one emits a different frequency than that one. That could be exactly the difference. But I see someone raised their flag there. You had a question, comment?
Well, Franklin, you just said whatever they're constructed of, which means that you're considering them to be constructed of something.
Yes, that would be correct. That the electron and the positron are made of a something.
There you go, and the something is the ether. Now you're down to the level of Michael.
No, I would disagree with that. I would say whatever the something is, it's fundamental.
Well, something is the ether. That's what the ether is. It's fundamental.
Yeah, so I say fundamental. We found that the electron and positrons are fundamental. Let's make the ether out of those guys, right? Instead of something mysterious.
They're fundamental atomic particles, but they're not fundamental to the ether.
No, they would be fundamental to the ether. The ether is, in fact, made of, if you make the ether out of positrons and electrons, then that explains where everything comes from.
If your electrons and positrons represent the balloons in your experiment with the vibration, what represents the media through which the vibrations between them is occurring?
The medium would still be these positron-electron units. The thing is that when the positron and electron are together, bound into a unit, neutrally charged, that acts as a completely independent, like a gas. The only time you see forces arise is if you have another separate electron over here, and there are a number of these other already joined ether units in between to act as a medium. But between an individual positron electron itself, there is actually no force. The only force that holds it together is probably that if it tries to get together, then other ether particles will get in between and then act as a medium, and then it'll immediately cause them to come together. So probably they might be that. Well, actually, I think they probably just stuck together just because that is the lowest energy configuration they can generally take. Because if they try to do anything else, then the electrostatic forces will kick back in. But otherwise, see, this is how you make the ether out of electrons and positrons, because they themselves, once they're joined, can act as the neutrally charged gaseous medium through which any other vibrations from independent electrons can go through. So as long as this thing's vibrating, this will cause the ether particles to vibrate, and that will transmit a wave. So that's all we need to transmit a wave. Is that a satisfactory answer?
No, because that's where you've got it backwards. Basically, the electron and positron are constituted as patterns of the ether.
You're a little bit quiet. Can you get closer to your microphone?
Like I said, I'm on the road, so it's really hard to do anything here.
Okay, I can still barely hear you, but I'm not. Let's see, someone called Admin SX. Did you have a comment?
That's me. It's Alistair. Sorry,
hey, Alistair.
That's my username on my computer. That's why it came up that way. Quite a while ago, I had presented about a specific shape.
Yes, you're kind of ball with the red and the
right.
Blue. Yes.
So if you view the red as being positive and the blue as being negative, or consider the red being like a positron and the blue being like an electron, then it becomes what you're talking about, where blue represents attraction, the red represents push. And if you took your red and your white Lego block and made them red and blue instead, and instead of treating them as two separate units, mashed them together into one, then you have your ether unit. But I had a question for Michael, because he's mentioned an ether unit. I wondered if he had a concept, a model, a shape for an ether unit, or what his ether unit was.
No, it's just a point locality of original space, and it was an elemental, the tiniest portion of original space, which would be self-compatibly oscillating with respect to all the other point localities, elemental or tiniest possible elemental point localities of space. And then you'd have to have a slight empty space in between each one to allow for oscillatory motion and later for vibratory motion of the ether. But I guess it'd be spherical. I don't know. I can't. That'd be a guess, though. I don't think it's an essential point as far as shape goes.
Yeah, I'm not sure whether So I replaced my blocks here. We're getting towards the end
there
of the conference, but I want to just say that what you're saying is because what I'm trying to do is find the commonalities between what Michael's saying, what you're saying, and what I'm saying. That throughout all three of our theories, have this commonality where we have this concept of opposites going on here. Now, whether the block is represented by blue and red, or red and white, or white and red, I mean, that's kind of not really that important. I mean, what's important is that we have this concept that we have an ether particle, and that it has this this concept of opposites within it. So,
Well,
I'm just saying that if this is your ether particle, then it is very identical to what I consider my ether particle, except as Michael says, that maybe the physical format of it, like you have your ball with the intertwined blue and red, that necessarily not that important. I mean, for me, I see ether particle as basically a joined dipole. So it has a positive end, it has a negative end. That's what it would be. It wouldn't be the intertwined thing of your particle, but maybe you might want to consider that. Maybe that's not an important aspect of what needs to go on here. So,
well, the reason that I stick to concluding that it's likely that the shape I propose is the correct shape of the ether unit is because that shape forces the vibrations to occur, because in order for them to all rotate, because it's not a perfect sphere, when they're rotating, there has to be oscillation that is a group oscillation. They have to move in conjunction with one another, because the red and the red waves have an ascending and descending property to them. So the ball itself, the nature of it physically, the shape creates the push and the pull and the left and the right and the up and the down, because of the inherent nature and property of the ball itself. I put into the chat a diagram.
Let's see here. What's your diagram here? This is your diagram of your you have your ether balls there. Although me personally, I really don't see that. So I consider that we know things that are positively charged, we know things that are negatively charged, we think these things have spherical symmetry, so therefore I don't see why they would intertwine like that, really. So,
well, the reason that this makes sense is because it doesn't need to invoke a charge. Instead, it creates the positive and negative in the motions, instead of saying, well, we have these things and these things have this charge. I don't really understand what charge is unless it's something that's created by something that makes logical sense by the shape of it. So these shape is like if you took two dipoles and you split them in half, shifted them off by a half a phase and put them back together again, you get this shape. This shape has a dipolar component to it.
well, I have to admit, I just still don't understand that. But unfortunately, we're getting to the end of our conference time here. Actually, I've run over a little bit, but that's because we're in this very interesting discussion about how the models are similar and how the models are different. So I think we found some similarities and some differences about certain elements of the three theories we've discussed here. Somehow come together. Now the answer is in there somewhere, maybe, or maybe we're all wrong, but that's what we're here to discuss. And so today we have discussed some various aspects of apparent ancient technology, even like the pyramids, or perhaps ancient nuclear wars, or how they use anti-gravity technologies to create these ancient structures, and speculated as to whether this was done with just using regular hand tools? Or like, we had the Coral Castle. Was that built with ordinary hand tools and technology, or was that using some mysterious technology that was lost with the Egyptian pyramids? So this is all speculation. And so this has been an interesting conversation. I thank everyone for participating. And we will do this again next week. This conference is normally in the same address and at the same time. So, and this week I was a little bit late about making the announcement, but you can always try and log in if you haven't seen the announcement. It should be same time, same place. So,
thank you, Franklin. It's been most interesting.
Get the recordings put on a site, please.
Yes, I'll go work on that right now. So we'll get things updated. It is kind of a manual process where I have to wait to download the whole thing, and then I have to go to YouTube and I have to upload the whole thing. So it takes a little bit of work to do that.